So I've been trying to work on a manuscript, but I've been really struggling with it. I've been directly struggling with it for a couple months. And so I think I need to really abandon the idea that I'm going to just sit down and write out some perfect thing right off the bat. I need to generate drafts. But what actually ends up happening is I'll generate about 4 or 5 paragraphs, and then I'll spend 2 weeks like finessing the language in those 4 or 5 paragraphs. And so, I mean, talk about premature optimization. It just occurred to me today, maybe the format is wrong. Maybe I need to talk a little bit before I can sit down and write. A little over a year ago, I suffered a couple personal traumas, kind of one after another. So there was this personal trauma, and then there was a strange psychological experience that was brought on by, really the intersection of 3 consciousness-modifying drugs, I would say. The first and the most literal being cannabis. The second being virtual reality. And then there was specifically what I was doing in virtual reality, which was a combination of very ascetic, meditative activity on the one hand, and then there was all the pornographic applications. And so it was a mixture of like sex, drugs, and VR. Not so much rock and roll. And there was a weird shift in my perception that started to happen. And I began to have it was like the impression of taking off a VR helmet only to discover that I hadn't left virtuality, that reality started to seem like virtual reality. And it was basically a kind of derealization, accompanied by a kind of depersonalization, because I also began to have the creeping feeling that not only was my reality virtual, but that I, in some way, was false, was merely some kind of a construct. And this was a very destabilizing thing that also really surprised me, because I've had a lifelong interest in philosophy, and it's been clear to me in an intellectual way that what we take to be reality, which is to say our experience of reality, is of course an artificial construction. It's a simulation running on your nervous system that is telling you something about some transcendental reality that exists beyond your representation of it. So this was something I had kind of known intellectually, but it didn't matter. The experiential manifestation of it was still absolutely shattering and really quite frightening. But one of the consequences of it was that I started to take that notion that that in a sense our perceptual hardware, if you like, the brain, that stuff in some way is really like a virtual reality helmet that you can't take off. You can't remove it. But it's always there, and it's structuring. In fact, it's compressing, it's filtering. It's simplifying the complexity of your environment. The point is that I had this depersonalizing experience on the back of a kind of a personal trauma, and then there was kind of a collective trauma that began to happen, which was the 2016 election. And so the end result of all of that, okay, this weird thing to do with drugs and sex and VR, and this personal thing that had really made me question a lot of the things that I took to be foundational about my life, and then this sort of political disaster. It was this very clear moment where I basically realized that I couldn't go back to my life the way that it was, because it had lost its meaning to me. Basically, I prayed for the first time since I was a little kid, and I wouldn't have called it that at the time, and I just didn't conceptualize of it that way. I didn't know who I was issuing this plea to. And then right on the heels of that, I started working on this book project. And what this book was going to be, at first it was going to be purely about this musician by the name of Daniel Lopatin. And then that started to blend with these other concerns about VR and perception. And this research that I had started doing into a field of inquiry called Cybernetics. Cybernetics is kind of it's one of the roots that feeds into modern systems theory. And I think a very interesting one, and one that's a little overlooked. People don't really remember cybernetics so much. But I was looking into cybernetics as a way of trying to get at some questions about the nature of consciousness. And in particular, I was reading Stafford Beer, so books like Brain of the Firm, as well as a very interesting book he wrote called Platform for Change. And I was also reading, Gregory Bateson, so like Ecology of Mind, and both Beer and Bateson were connecting cybernetics to psychological ideas, with Bateson focusing a little more on the psychology, and Beer in a way focusing more on the neurophysiology. Beer has this interesting thing called the viable systems model, which is adapted from it's trying to abstract what makes the human nervous system work so well in terms of the hierarchies of control. And then Bateson, to talk about Bateson's work would require more of a digression, I think. But in any case, so I was reading all this stuff about cybernetics, and then I was listening to all this Daniel Lopatin music. And a strange thing started to happen, which is that I started to kind of read through Lopatin back to cybernetics. In other words, this music, and in particular his most recent record, if you don't count his latest soundtrack thing, was Garden of Delete. And that record seemed to me, I started to see like cybernetic themes and other themes about the nature of consciousness embedded in that work. And it became an interesting kind of chicken and egg thing in a way, because it was like, is the music just this very evocative, complex thing that can sort of shapeshift to a degree, and so then you can project various things into it? Or is there really a deeper, in some sense, structural or formal similarity, perhaps even deliberate? And I didn't ever really get an answer to that, but I was developing pretty sophisticated, like reads, like interpretations of these different Lopatin pieces, and so that project was kind of rolling along. But of course, I have a natural inclination not just to try to represent what other people have been thinking about, but to do some original thinking as well. So I was trying to take what I was learning from cybernetics and develop my own little model of subjectivity. I was interested in trying to take a cybernetic approach, is maybe the best way to put it, a cybernetic approach to phenomenology. I wanted to argue backwards from the giveness of experience to what the underlying, system architecture might be, or perhaps must be, to support then what we perceive as our experience. And so then the book became a kind of a triple structure. It was like 1/3 of it was going to be about this music, another third was going to be about issues to do with systems, simulation, and cybernetics, and then there was this third part that was going to be kind of me synthesizing that all together into some kind of a unique philosophical system. But then I started to hit these strange barriers. And eventually I realized, and actually I think I realized fairly quickly, that in a sense it was the same obstacle I was encountering everywhere. Basically that obstacle had to do with the nature of the unconscious. So when you start doing this kind of metacognitive thing where you're thinking about something, but then you're not just doing that, you're also at the same time at a higher level paying attention to what's happening when you're thinking. How am I forming this thought, right? And when you start to do that, you realize that a tremendous amount of what we, in a post hoc way, assign to conscious intelligence isn't really conscious at all. Things just kind of emerge out of some depth. And you encounter that in multiple domains. So one of the places where you encounter it is for instance, like what I'm doing right now, which is speaking. Now, when I speak, it's almost completely automatic. I don't think about consciously at all about like word choice or grammatical rules or how to build a sentence or how to make a coherent paragraph. I don't think about any of that at all. At best, I'm kind of doing a very high-level teleological steering by thinking in pretty general ways where I want the ideas to go. And then it's like the speech just self-organizes around that in a completely automated, unconscious way. So how does that work? I mean, that already implies the existence of a pretty sophisticated like subsystem in the psyche that just deals with articulating ideas in speech. Well, all this time I had been constructing these visual diagrams, little cybernetic diagrams, just trying to identify, what are the major components of consciousness. And, I had this circle that was kind of unconscious stuff. And it's like that circle kept growing because, okay, everything to do with speech has to go in there. But then what about just the basic way in which things appear to me? I don't have control over like the low-level mappings of my perception. Red appears as red. I can't swap out the palette for something else. Take something even more fundamental, right? Which now we're getting into like Kantian categories. So like the fundamental modalities, let's say, of time and space. We don't know that those are accurate representations. We know that they're functional representations, and that has to do with some stuff, some Darwinian stuff. So we know that they're functional, but we don't know that they're accurate in any way. And whatever they are, we know that they're profoundly constructive. So what's constructing all that? Again, it's not conscious. I don't consciously put together my sense data and, create an environment out of that, or a representation of an environment. That just happens, and it happens really fast and dynamically. Well, again, that's some kind of an unconscious system. And what that system does is it creates a simulative holographic reality that then we as egos inhabit. Well, okay, the circle needs to get a little bigger. So there's also this whole reality building thing that lives in the unconscious. Well, then what about spontaneous fantasy, daydreams, actual dreams? All of that also seems like it's coming from something unconscious. So over the course of working on this project, first of all, the unconscious as a concept started to come into my consciousness, and then my relationship to that idea began to evolve. I eventually realized that I wasn't going to have anything like a workable theory of consciousness until I addressed this question of the unconscious. That it was just whatever consciousness is this like tiny little drop in this ocean of unconsciousness. But of course it presents a real empirical problem because it's unconscious. So how do you say anything about it at all? How do you gain access to it? And basically, as soon as that question had materialized, I seem to have a phone call coming in. Just a second. So what was I saying? So I was saying that as soon as I turned my attention towards the unconscious, weird things started to happen. And this is extremely difficult to describe, but it was as if I began to detect the presence of a second author messing around with my diagrams. Really, these were very crude things. they essentially amounted to just trying to identify, here's the system, and that's called the psyche, and then here's all the different subsystems that I can identify. I wasn't even saying yet very much about how those systems may be operated. It was just trying to name them and describe how they related to each other in a kind of a network structure. So I was looking at one of my models one day, and suddenly it occurred, I had an intuition about it. And the intuition was that it was that there was something aesthetically the matter with it. And so I sat down to try to fix it and just started playing around. I'm working on this thing, and finally it kind of clicks into place, and I'm like, there, that's what it's supposed to be. And I kind of like literally almost like step back from it and look at the whole thing. And I realize that what I've drawn is the staff of Hermes. Like the caduceus, with the twin serpents ascending a central column, and then a kind of something that fans out at the top, like wings in the traditional depiction. It's the same imagery that appears in the Kundalini chakra system. So, it kind of makes sense in a way, because the model that I was working on is a representation of the nervous system. It is kind of a column with, input and output channels of information flowing up and down it that culminates in this big brain thing at the top. So it does have that basic shape. And what was so weird about it was that I didn't consciously intend to do that, and I didn't at that point in time I had no knowledge about symbolism or anything like that. It was not something that was really ever on my radar. And also it's kind of ominous because it seemed to connect what I was doing to a kind of historical lineage. It's like, here I am thinking about the nature of consciousness, which is also probably what the yogis were thinking about. And I'm trying to draw something that represents it. And look, I just happened to accidentally reproduce exactly the same image. It was like I would produce things, whether it was writing or these schematic drawings or pieces of art, and then I would analyze them later and find things in them that I didn't consciously put there, but that nevertheless were highly organized, patterned, and often seemed to relate in some way to archetypal material. Although again, I didn't have the language of archetype at that point. And so, okay, put a pin in that, and we'll get back to that. But now I want to articulate this other thing that started happening around the same time. I was experimenting with video feedback processes, and I had in particular this analog video mixer that was really great for feedback. And I'd been playing around with it for a couple of days, and one day I was sitting around in front of it, and I hit on this particular combination of settings and patchings that manifested this beautiful evolving cloud of green gas. Something about it really grabbed me. And so I did what I do whenever I get an interesting video thing. I recorded it. I recorded it to my hard drive. I kept returning to it in my imagination spontaneously. And again, I started to think about it in symbolic terms, because it was like, I was like, this is a perfect image for my book, because it encapsulates so much. First of all, it's a feedback thing, so it relates to cybernetics and systems, and it's a kind of an order out of chaos thing in that respect. It also was this strange hybrid of the organic and the artificial. Furthermore, the greenness of it implied, I was thinking of like green screen, and so simulation, and say perhaps the simulative arena of subjectivity. But then also it seemed to relate to cannabis. And so all of that kind of came together in this image. But then something else interested me about it, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then one day it just kind of popped in. It was just like, it reminded me of this John Carpenter film called Prince of Darkness. And it's because it's a central image in that film. It's this like glass tank of swirling green. It's kind of somewhere between a gas and a liquid. And so that's why it reminded me of it. But then I had this deeper intuition on top of it, which was that you should watch this film. And not just you should watch it, but you should watch it because there's something important for the book in it. It was a film I had only seen once before. I'd seen it once, and I liked it. I especially liked the score. And I thought it was a really interesting film and a haunting film. But I couldn't make much sense out of it. And in fact, if you go online and look at reviews for Prince of Darkness, you'll see that that's basically the overwhelming reaction to it. Is story doesn't make any sense, character motivations don't make any sense. You know, don't go to it expecting some kind of a coherent statement. Just go to it for a surreal trip into, horror and madness, basically. And so I did. I got a hold of the film and watched it. And it was like watching a different film. It was similar to the things I was noticing in my own work, which is to say that there were quiet, tiny elements that were so quiet that they hover right at the level of subliminality, but that nevertheless seem to be organized and that seem to have some kind of a symbolic function in the context of the film. Things that you normally would consider like incidental details that somehow together seem to add up to something. So I was noticing these things in this film. And furthermore, it was similar to what was happening with the Lopatin music. It was like cybernetic ideas and ideas about the nature of perception seemed to be running through this film. And pitched at this level where, again, I couldn't quite be totally sure if I was just projecting this stuff in there or whether it was actually there. I'm going to have a lot more to say about Prince of Darkness, but I want to put a pin in that now too, because I've got to deploy all these different threads because they all interrelate. But I'm actually feeling a little fatigued from talking now, so I think that I will resume this tomorrow, and we'll pick off right here. So yeah, that's it for now.